For this review, I kind of feel like I've strapped some explosives to my chest that are ready to blow up around me as I'm kind of walking into a field of landmines known as Christian nationalism. I have some good and bad things to say about a new book on that topic of Christian nationalism. Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor by Campbell. This was published in July of 2024 by IVP Press. This book is here to help non-Christian nationalists reach out to their Christian nationalist neighbors, church members, and family with Jesus Christ's peace, truth, and grace. I think this book has potential, but it fell short due to what I would call a shallow presentation of Christian nationalism in America today. And if you have a few moments, I would love to tell you about Disarming Leviathan by Campbell, where I think this book missed the mark and where it also has some good advice when it comes to believers engaging with unbelievers today. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand Christian nationalism in this world that Christians have been placed in today, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my latest reviews. Also, please like and share this video with other people to help them know about the work of Campbell. I feel like in order to critique this book, I need to share my own thoughts on Christian nationalism because I think that reveals where Disarming Leviathan had its big misstep. And that is, there are two things I believe every reader of this book should understand regarding the movement that is presented as Christian nationalism. First, Christian nationalism, when placed in the larger stream of church history, is the dominant view of the church. You could even say that from Constantine's vision of the cross in the year 312 to the rise of the Anabaptists during the Reformation, the church was exclusively, or nearly exclusively, made up with Christian nationalists. And even as late as the 19th century, the large majority of Christians would fall under the category of Christian nationalism. Caleb in this book calls Christian nationalism a movement that calls Christian followers to take government power at all cost to advance their preferred way of being in the world. Now, I don't have a lot of debate with that definition or that view, but if you look at the actions of the Holy Roman Empire, the Lutherans in Germany during the time of the Reformation, and even the English Protestants in Ireland as recently as the mid-1800s, Christian nationalism is the majority view of church history. Those who don't want Christian followers to be taking government power by whatever means necessary are in the minority when it comes to church history. And I think this is an important point to understand just how common it is for Christians to embrace that worldview and should help us in engaging those who hold it today. Second, there are two strands of Christian nationalism today, and I don't think that reality is covered at all in this book. I would call the first strand the political Christian nationalism, and the second the religious Christian nationalism. Campbell almost deals exclusively with the political branch of Christian nationalism. Political Christian nationalism is seen most clearly through the work of groups such as Turning Point USA. Political Christian nationalism is when groups that are expressly political, such as Turning Point, they end up using churches to create political support and passion for their causes. And I would say this is used equally by conservative and progressive political groups. Both sides of the aisle will send politicians into churches. Churches will even use the church bus to drive church members to the polls to vote. And at times, it'll be difficult to tell if your church service has all of a sudden morphed into a political rally, or if your political rally is more of a church service. And I'm not a fan of any of this. I follow political views that are similar to J.N. Darby, which I think should be the common view among dispensationalists today. And that is the view that the melding of church and politics typically corrupts both, and corrupts the church even more. In fact, the dangers of corrupting the church are so much higher than the potential for good And if you want to see that proven out, just look at church history for an abundance of illustrations, that Caleb is right, that we are doing harm to both the gospel and the state when the church is being used by political activists. I just wish he would have taken an opportunity to clarify that this really isn't a right-wing issue. And he almost exclusively went after right-wing groups like Turning Point USA and barely mentions progressive groups who are involved in very similar behavior. I want to get politics out of all of our churches during our Sunday worship. I want them to be focused on the exposition of the Bible, the worship of Jesus Christ. And so I want the politics on both the right and the left side out. Now, I do also want to say I love having Christians in government. I want a government that reflects what we learn in the Bible about the principles of justice. But I desire to see this happen through individual Christians pursuing careers in politics and not a movement that is directed by the church or outside groups are coming in and calling on the church to be specifically involved, because the state will end up directing the church in the end when this happens, which is what all churches end up getting into if they allow themselves to be used by political groups. But there's another branch of Christian nationalism that was barely touched in this book, and it baffles me that it was hardly mentioned. And that's what I call religious Christian nationalism. This is the Christian nationalism of Doug Wilson, Joel Webbon, Stephen Wolfe, and others. This is based primarily in post-millennial eschatology. Those who want to put what they call a Christian strongman, a Christian prince, as a monarch-type leader in America. Often you hear these men talking about wanting to remove the votes of women or to reenact medieval laws that would outlaw religions outside of Christianity, or even more specific, would only allow their own brand of Christianity to be the state church. And the religious Christian nationalists are in no way aligned with political Christian nationalism, where right-wing conservatives are trying to mobilize the church for politics. In fact, the religious Christian nationalists very often would see those groups as catering to society and standing in the way of their goals. The reason I'm shocked that that group, religious Christian nationalism, was not the focus of this book is that, one, religious Christian nationalists have fully embraced the title Christian nationalism. As far as I can tell, they've embraced the label even more than the political wing. And then second, they are so much more adversarial, combative, and if there's somebody that I want help with in learning how to handle and to speak to, it's that group. It's those in the Doug Wilson, Joel Webbon camp who would gladly tear a church in half to force their political views on the whole. And so to see them mostly ignored in a book with the subtitle, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, the form of Christian nationalist that I wanted to help loving, is barely mentioned in this book. And then his so-called historical experts would probably end up saying that any Christian who voted for Donald Trump would end up being a Christian nationalist, and end up really a lot of the times in this book equating conservative right-wing Christians to all of a sudden be Christian nationalists, because the issues that he's dealing with in this book are basically political values such as gun control, ending illegal immigration, and school choice. And instead of going after the more extreme group that is really destructive, the views of New Christendom, whose views are based in eschatology, Psalm 110, they're in line with a lot of older views in church history, I want help with them. And so I would say, if you want to glean from what's good in this book, I would encourage you first to watch or listen to the podcasts by Pastor Jeremy Howard on Christian nationalism first. They're on the Do Theology podcast. I'll put a link to it in the description, but I think Howard does the best job describing the Christian nationalism landscape today. And once you get that, I do think there's some good wisdom in this book, because I do think Caleb gives very helpful advice on how to engage with those in the world that have a polar opposite or combative view to our own. His advice on hospitality and how to speak to people was excellent. And he's got a lot of advice on here about how we should be sharing the gospel with people who would naturally provoke our anger. And the hard part about this review is I do kind of feel like if Caleb had a better grasp on Christian nationalism, if he could pull out the real background of this view throughout church history, if he did a better job pulling out the views of those on the religious side, those extreme views, I think this could have ended up being an excellent book because of his tactics on engaging and loving those that you disagree with, not seeing them as your enemies. That was really good. In fact, if Caleb wrote a book just on that topic, on how to engage with other people who have a very antagonistic view to your own, I think that would be an excellent book. But this book is specifically called Disarming Leviathan. It's specifically on Christian nationalism. And I felt like the way he described Christian nationalism fell so far short of how it is in America today, that the landscape of it, that I felt like I needed to spend the majority of my review talking about how I, at least from my perspective, I see Christian nationalism in America today. So if you're looking specifically for an understanding of this movement of Leviathan, a description of Christian nationalism, I think you should go elsewhere for that. But if you're just looking for a book that's going to give you good advice on how to talk to somebody that you disagree with, how to have the right perspective when you view them, I think Caleb Campbell has some good advice on that front.